scripture reading this morning is from Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 22. Hear the voice of God. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. They said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters. For it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." When Naomi, saw that Ruth, was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. This is the inspired and inerrant word of God. May He bless its truths to our souls. You may be seated. The children are dismissed to their classes. It's difficult at the beginning of a sermon to arrive at an emotion sort of immediately. Everyone's still settling in. There's this introduction. People are sitting down, finding your spots, thinking about what's been going on. Maybe a line in the song. Maybe something else you have planned for the day. But we sort of need together to move to a sort of deep emotional place immediately for the text's sake. Because if you remember where we left Naomi last week, we left her sort of suffering under the frowning providence of God. God had withheld the rain back in Bethlehem, and He had brought famine into the land, breadlessness in the house of bread. And instead of, as we saw they should have last week, instead of maybe remaining in the land and returning to faithful belief and faithful practice and resting in the providential hand of Yahweh on behalf of his people, Naomi and her family had run to Moab for food. And it was there, remember, it was there that Naomi experienced the worst decade of her life. It was there that she lost her husband, her protector, her covenant companion, the husband of her youth, the provider. And then her boys had married very kind pagan women who bore her no grandchildren. And then her sons had died. These sons who had become, after Elimelech's death, her protectors and providers, the very strength of her womb made manifest before her, her children, her boys providing for her. And her daughters-in-law, as we'll see, have been very kind to her. But her sons and her husband have died. And so, perhaps because it's difficult to enter into the emotional grief of another person, I might encourage you to remember this morning perhaps the darkest season of your life. A season characterized by deep and frowning clouds. A time perhaps characterized by overwhelming waves of emotion, bitter struggle, faithless days, and sleepless nights. Perhaps even a passing consideration or a raging temptation to end everything. A season that truly shook your soul. Think for a moment about that. And for some of you, that may be a very distant memory, perhaps clear but distant, or perhaps, as Ecclesiastes says God does on occasion, joyfully faded. For others, you may be right in the middle of that. You might be saying, yeah, that's today. That's this last year. That's this last week. And for others, perhaps you think, and you're like, honestly, I don't know if I have one of those. I don't know if I have an incredibly deep or dark season of my life, and it may just be that you don't get one. It may just be that it is pending. So consider that moment, and then I'd like to point your attention to verses 20 and 21 to hear Naomi at the end of this text and hear her cries as she enters back home, back to Bethlehem. She says, "Do not call me Naomi," which means sweetness or pleasantness, this name named after perhaps a nicer time, a more joyous day, a day of refreshment, a day of delight. She says, I don't know that anymore. That's not me. That's not my life. Rename me. Call me Mara, which means bitterness. And then you see the poetry, this play on words, because Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord brought me home again empty. Why call me Naomi? Since Yahweh has testified against me, and Shaddai has afflicted me. She is wounded and hurting, and in a very deep and dark spot in this last truly decade of her life. And you can see that she's speaking about herself, these lines that are aligned left, and then you can see that she's speaking about God in these indented lines, and you can see that she's saying, everything that I'm experiencing is His fault. It's from Him. Look what He did. And there's parallelism. She speaks of Shaddai and then Yahweh and Shaddai. And this title, the Almighty, is a title for the supreme overseer of the heavenly council, the one who has the final word, final authority. According to Job, He's the provider of providence. According to Genesis, He's the very giver of life, the opener of the womb, the blesser with children, and the one who gives promise. And as one who has experienced here the frowning providence of God, Naomi is understandably wondering if the one who controls the heavenly council is for her or if he is against her. Everything she's tasted from her experience in the last 10 years has said, the Almighty is against me. He's held counsel and accused me. He's identified me sort of as guilty and laid punishment after punishment upon her. That's how she feels. She says, I left full. A little bit of an interesting play on words if you think about why she left. She left hungry. But that's not really what she's talking about. It's not that what she's saying is untrue. She's talking about her womb and her husband and her inheritance, her family. She had strength. She had one beside her and two below her to all support and provide for her. She was full. And now, what does she have? She has nothing, no strength, no one. She totally sort of overlooks Ruth in this moment. But she says, I don't have anything. I'm completely vulnerable. Why has this happened? Yahweh emptied me. I had everything. He took it all away. Have you felt this way? Have you had, perhaps, this season of your life, a time of brokenness and mourning? These are sort of ugly phases, ugly in what we experience and ugly in the sort of stumbling response that we have. Faithful or faithless, it's often full of tears and questions, psalms of lament. So this leads us to a prepositional question and answer, or a propositional question and answer. The question is, how should we respond to the frowning providence of God? When life is threatened and hope is lost, when God deals bitter circumstances to you and brings you low, when the ones that you love and the things that you long for are lost, when the hand of God sort of casts this very dark shadow on your life, when He empties you, how should you respond? The answer is turn toward Him. Turn toward Him. Run to Christ. Believe on Jesus. Walk in the hope of salvation and the sworn goodness of God to His children. Doubt your doubts and trust His word. Believe now that you, even if you can't bring yourself to say it today, believe that you will say later, I was not as empty as I felt. For God was before me, and He was beside me, and He was behind me. Yes, God was and is in me, and I am complete in Him, in whom are hidden all the treasures of assurance and wisdom and every good thing. In a moment when you feel completely unassured, unwise, and with every evil thing falling upon your lap, believe now that you might say later, His frowning providence was kind, for He led me into Himself. He took what I loved, but He gave me something better. He never made a mistake. How should we respond to the frowning providence of God? Turn toward Him. And that is precisely what happens in verse 6. Then Naomi arose, she rises with her daughters-in-law that she might turn away from Moab and return to the very presence of Yahweh. For God, she has heard, is now visiting his people, as demonstrated by the fact that there is rain and there is now harvest. There is, yes, bread again in the house of bread. So providence, his presence is demonstrated in effect. It is shown by things that occur, things that we run over in our lives, that we come across in our lives. That word, return, is the narratival theme, the key word, only in chapter 1, because this is when this is happening in the book. 12 times as we read through this text, or as we read through and will now look through this text, you'll find this idea, return. So if you're someone who's circling, underlining, definitely grab a circle for return and throw them all over chapter 1. And notice the unique ways that it's going to be used. Even Naomi telling her daughters-in-law to go home, to return back to Moab, while she's trying to go home back to Bethlehem. So that's the sort of theme. The picture is a turn, which is significant in the life of a woman who has spent the last 10 years where she ought not have been. She is going home. Why does she do that? For, verse 6, she had heard that in the country of Moab that the Lord, Yahweh, had visited his people by giving them bread. A good word about home, not necessarily from home, but about home. Yahweh had visited his people by giving them bread. This is one of only 2 times in the entire book of Ruth that God is specifically mentioned as acting, because so much of the book of Ruth is about the hidden hand of God, the providential hand of God in our lives. And here it's revealed, it's shown. The narrator says specifically that God has done something by means of a report that Naomi receives in Moab. Though, as we saw in 20 and 21, Naomi is very reluctant to acknowledge any sweetness in God's providence. She still turns her face there, sets her feet there, and she heads back to the house of bread where God is kindly providing for his people. I do believe this is an act of faith from a very broken woman. And we'll return to this idea, but that's often messy. We are often messy, even as believers in crisis. Then there's a bit of this story, it's kind of interesting how we're not sure how many people are going to end up in Bethlehem all throughout. You know, Naomi's the one that arises, and then she sort of has 2 tag-alongs, and she's trying to send them home, and they say no, and she sends them home, and one says yes, and one says no, and then 2 eventually arrive in Judah, right? 2 eventually arrive in Bethlehem, and we know that, Naomi and Ruth, but that's sort of how the story is played. We're just not sure what's going to happen. And the way that this is structured is by a series of 3 exchanges between Ruth and the girls, in which every time Ruth or Naomi first tells the girls to stay in Moab. What a great evangelist. She tells the girls to stay in Moab. Don't come with me. Even I have nothing for you. What a great evangelist. And then the girls' response. A series of 3 exchanges. Let's look at the first one in verses 8 through 10. Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws, "Go, return, each to her mother's house. Yahweh deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Yahweh grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." This is very interesting. She first formally return. There we have it. That's now the 3rd time in the text. So if you don't have 2 circled before then, glance up. Return. to your mother's house. She is freeing them from any sort of commitment that is remaining from this mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. She says, you're free. Just go. And then she blesses them. She blesses them even with the very blessing of Yahweh. It's fascinating what happens here. She says, Yahweh, deal kindly. This is another good one to underline because it's one of 3 times that are pretty significant that the word chesed, or the loving kindness, the covenant loyalty, the love above and beyond loves, is demonstrated. And who does she ultimately attribute it to? To her 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws. Yahweh be loving, may He demonstrate loving kindness to you as you have shown me and my house loving kindness. She puts forward Ruth and Orpah as the examples of loving kindness for God to follow. It's been a long time since she's been home. I think she's a little bit fuzzy on her theology, but it does clear up. And that story occurs through the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verse 20. Blessed is he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. She remembers that God has been faithful to her, but here she simply remember Yahweh who's afflicted her, Shaddai who's against her. May He just have an ounce of goodness left for you as you have abundantly shown love to me. But it does at least show that they have a very warm relationship, a good one. It's a good house, although the house is filled with sorrow. And then interestingly, she says, return where? To your mother's house. That's a little bit unique. Normally you would say return to your father's house. But throughout both one moment in Genesis and then a few times in the wisdom literature, the house of your mother contextually involves love and remarriage. And so it seems that Naomi's really encouraging them, as we see throughout the rest of the text, that the next best step for them is to go get remarried. That is where she believes they have hope. That is where she believes they have healing and where they have a blessed future. But may Yahweh show you kindness. She still mentions His name. She still blesses the girls in His name. And she knows that the authority of Yahweh extends beyond the borders of Israel. But these girls too have been emptied. And Naomi views this move, remarriage, return to your mother's house, as the means to their fullness. How do they respond? Well, remember, this is a very deep emotional day. It's not over for them. They're not past the grief. They're all a hot mess. They're all just wailing together at the reality of their circumstances, at their vulnerability, at their loss. And so she kisses them farewell. She says goodbye, and they lift up their voices and they're weeping and they say, no, we will return with you to your people. We hear that again later, right? That's almost like a foreshadowing of the heartbeat of what Ruth will get at. And they both say it together, okay? So 8 through 10, exchange 1 is, you are free to remarry, and God richly bless you as you have even more richly blessed me. No, we'll stay with you. Second exchange, verses 11 through 14. Naomi's most extended entreaty against them coming with her. And there's sort of 3 parts to it. The first is verse 11, 2 questions. Turn back, that's return. My daughters, why will you go with me? And are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Answer in verse 12. No, you shouldn't go with me because I have nothing for you. No, there are no sons in my womb that they may be your husband. She says, I'm too old to have a husband. Let's say Naomi's 15 when she gets married, 20 by the time she has the boys. They're 20 when they get remarried or when they get married. And now it's been 10 years of marriage and then death. So she's at least 50. Let's put her approximately there, 50 to 60 probably. She says, I can't have children, too old for a husband. Even it doesn't look as though she's pursued remarriage in the last 10 years when Elimelech has been gone. She says, I don't have hope. She's talking about her womb. She's like, I don't have hope. There's not another son in here for you. And even if, let's just play this out, girls, even if I could get married tonight, and even if I conceived tonight, then you got to wait how long? Like, you're not going to wait for my baby boy to grow up and marry him. That doesn't make any sense. Keep in mind, they've already been married 10 years and are still barren. Go home to the house of your mother. Have hope. Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? 13. And then the third piece of this, no, my daughters. For it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of Yahweh has gone out against me. She's saying, my bitterness is too bitter for you to participate in. My bitterness will last through the end of my days. I'm done. I have nothing. I have no one. Go home, find a new life, find a new husband. Leave me to die. This is what the Shaddai wants for me. And so once again, 14, they lift up their voices and they weep again. But now there's a fork in the road. There's a split decision in this second exchange. And Orpah then returns the kiss to her mother-in-law, also saying farewell. And we'll see in a moment that she has gone down the road back to her people, back to her gods. But Ruth does not take the same route. She clings. She's probably weeping over and holding on to Naomi. And then we have this third exchange, 15 through 18, where Ruth really is the main character. But one more time, Naomi in verse 15 says, look, here's even an example of what you should do. Your sister-in-law has returned, circle that, and to her people and to her gods, return after your sister-in-law. So look, there she goes. Go after her. Follow her. One more, Let's have this over with. But Ruth said, and here we have some of the most beautiful verses in the Old Testament. They're wonderful. Her response is fantastic. And she says, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so you have a chiastic structure here. The beginning and end are these challenges, oaths that she makes. She first says to Naomi, stop. I don't want to hear this word again 3 times, and even 3 times in the second piece. So like 5 times now you've entreated me to go. Stop saying that. I'm not going anywhere. Don't tell me one more time to turn back from following after you. And then she gives this, what's called in poetry, a merism in B and B prime. I will be with you in life. I will be with you in death, which means that anywhere and everywhere, from now till your last breath, my life is for you. My presence is with you. This is her oath to Naomi, particularly, that where she lays her head at night, Ruth will lay her head at night. Where her steps lead her, Ruth's steps will follow. Even when Naomi is lying on her deathbed, whether that be in Moab or in Bethlehem or somewhere all the way across the world, who will be right by her side? Ruth will be by her side. And I will even in my death be buried in the same place that you are buried. And if you remember from Genesis, that's pretty significant. That's familial. This is like the family burying cave. This is the place. It's an honorable thing to be buried together with somebody else. And she says, my life is yours. The Moabitess does demonstrate chesed to Naomi. Naomi's not wrong that she's been very generous, very kind, overwhelmingly so. Even more so than Naomi is. Of course, Naomi feels the pressure of having nothing to offer, nothing to give, which isn't true, but it feels that way societally, culturally, sort of historically. The way it's not true is spiritually. She should have remembered this piece, but no, go home, go home. Ruth says, I will not. And right in the center, it's verbless. So any verbal idea is supplied, which is why translation-wise I scratched out shall be, just because I think it stands very powerfully without a verb. Your God, my God. That's significant. Ruth and Naomi have nothing. They're nobodies. They're vulnerable. But what do they have? Well, they may have a neighbor, and they have the name of their gods. Orpah, no condemnation historically or practically to her. It's good and right that she does what she does from that standpoint. She goes back home to her family, her people, and to her gods. But now what Ruth is saying is, I don't have a people and I don't have gods where I've grown up. I only have them now in relation to you. She is uniting herself with true Israel. She is uniting herself with Yahweh. This is the birth of a woman who fears the Lord. And already she's demonstrating the character of a woman who fears the Lord. And very generous to Naomi, and even saying things perhaps that she doesn't understand the depth of spiritually. Nevertheless, I'm thoroughly convinced that this is Ruth's conversion. A Moabite to an Israelite. Someone who walks the path of folly unto death to somebody who walks the path of wisdom unto life. From an unbeliever who had no ears to hear, now to a believer whose ears are open to the voice and the authority and the people of God himself. And from a practical perspective in the narrative, Ruth wins the argument. Verse 18, now when Naomi saw that Ruth is very determined to go with her, may God give us this determination, she stopped seeking to dissuade her. The conversation is over. And so they walk. So they go home to Bethlehem. Now at the very end, after the interaction with her neighbors, upon which they sort of exclaim like, whoa, is this you? And I genuinely think it's not only that it's been 10 years, it's that it's been the worst 10 years of her life. I don't think Naomi looks like what she looked like. I think she is grief-stricken and has aged and is bent down with the sorrow of life. And they say, Naomi? Like, lift your head. Is this you? And they're excited. There's all this buzz. It's a vulnerable moment. Doesn't know if she's going to be received or rejected. Well, what story is she going to tell? Where have you been? We were wondering what had happened to you. And she goes on to account exactly how God has afflicted her, as we saw earlier. Call me bitterness. But then at the very end, so 22, Naomi returned, and Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned, so two returners from the country of Moab, and then just a transition moment, a sneak peek, a little bit of hope, even in the midst of a very crisis-oriented chapter, where, as we know, having read the reveal last week, that David and Jesus, their lineage is at stake here. Their lineage is in crisis. It looks like there's no way that even the Messiah could be born. It's a sort of terrifying chapter from that regard. And historically, in these two women's lives, it's an awful chapter. But they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Rain, food, fertility, they're all sort of in the air. There is hope and life in the air. So, a few points of reflection. Naomi's faith is quite a topic of conversation amongst students of the book of Ruth. This moment is the strongest moment against her, and then there is question also about her motives, the beginning of chapter 3. Is Naomi a godly woman? Does she have faith, or does she not? And who holds the scale? Who holds the scale of faith and bitterness, which are both present in Naomi's life and in this chapter? Her faith calling on even blessing from the name of Yahweh, hearing that Yahweh's presence is in Bethlehem, and she goes there, and then she's blessing her daughters-in-law in the name of Yahweh, and she even recognizes the sovereignty of Yahweh in her life while she is very angry about it. All of these things say, and the rest of the book says, she's going home, meaning she is of true Israel. She worships the one true God. Some people would not like even that is being said, because look at her. I mean, look how messy this is. She's renaming herself against God and accusing him time after time of all these things that he has done. But who holds the scale of faith and bitterness, and is even the scale exactly what it's about? The question is not how much faith is Naomi demonstrating here. Is it enough that she would convince us she's of true Israel? That's not really the question. The question is, whom does she believe? Is Yahweh her hope in life and death? And the fact that she, after a 10-year, you might say, departure from the presence and the family and the place of God, she turns. She arises and she turns. She goes once again to the house of faith in the name of Yahweh. Think about those mentioned in the hall of faith in Hebrews 11. Maybe most particularly, Samson. When you read about him in Judges, in which setting this book finds its home, would you say that Samson is a man who fears the Lord? Would you say that Samson is filled with godly character, a good example for us to follow? Far from it. It's not about how much faith you demonstrate. It is about whether God knows you and you know him. That is the question. Or remember perhaps 2 Peter chapter 2, which calls Lot one of the most infamous characters in the Old Testament, from which the Moabite line has come as a product of gross sexual immorality. And Peter says, or consider righteous Lot. What? Righteous Lot? Yes, the Lord, He knows how to deliver the righteous, the godly out of temptations, and how to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. God knows the people who are His and the people who are not. And it is revealed, I believe, even in this chapter, and certainly in what follows, that Naomi is a woman who fears the Lord. We would do well, family of grace, to have compassion on people in the middle of the frowning providence of God in their lives. That is a dark and sorrowful valley that we could stand from, maybe past our own valley or on the side of theirs, and say, but Psalm 23 says that God is with you in the valley, so you don't need to fear, and that would be true and maybe appropriate. But we would do well, perhaps like Job's friends began, to sit, to be careful, to seek to exercise wisdom, to be very gracious. If you very often have walked with people through the deepest sorrows of their lives, you will know that it can be very ugly, even from the good ones. And it can be tricky because sometimes the bad ones look like their faith is stronger than the good ones at times. So let us be gracious, generous, and seek to be wise. They've gone home, and we should too. Remember the question, how should we respond to the frowning providence of God in our lives? Turn toward Him. So, Naomi, suffering saint, run into the arms of God. Believe His goodness. House of God, is this Naomi? Be patient with those in pain. Encourage faith with confidence, but administer truth with wisdom. The question is not, is God good? The answer is, God is good. Hold that confidently, but administer it wisely. And then Ruth, suffering sinner, Moabitess, one who is outside of the family of faith, one who is condemned, one who is unfit for entrance into the very temple of God. Run into the strong arms of Yahweh. Plead with Him for life and for forgiveness. Believe in His goodness. Align yourself with the people of God. And may that house be your house. And may that God be your God. Run into the house of God. So once again, how shall we respond, family, to the frowning providence of God? Turn toward Him. Our Father, we come before You